What if the doors you keep closed were the very ones that could bring light into your life? Under the gray New York sky, Nina Carter adjusted her scarf around her neck as she balanced a tray full of steaming cups. The sweet smell of hot chocolate filled the air, mixing with the sound of Christmas bells and laughter outside. It was her 4th hour of the morning shift at the small, crowded Brooklyn coffee shop, and her energy seemed endless, even though her feet hurt. She thanked the customer with a warm smile and a kind voice before quickly turning around to serve another table. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan Grayson was deep into a video conference with his company's major shareholders. His right hand adjusted his thin-framed glasses, while his left hand drummed on the oak table. Irritated by the slowness of a presentation, he interrupted the junior executive's monotonous flow with a firm tone, making it clear that he did not tolerate mediocrity, before abruptly ending the meeting. His gaze quickly shifted to the clock. Lucas and Sophie needed to be picked up from music class, but he couldn't leave Nut with the pressure of a billion-dollar contract hanging over him. Back at the cafeteria, Nina sighed with relief as she took off her apron at the end of her shift. It was a cold afternoon, and her thin jacket barely kept out the wind as she walked to a client's apartment in Upper Manhattan. There, she worked as a nanny, taking care of 3-year-old twins who loved to make a mess more than any toy. Despite his exhaustion, his mind was focused on the day's to-do list. He needed to deliver medicine to his mother before nightfall, buy Christmas decorations on sale, and if everything went well, maybe prepare something special for dinner. When Ethan finally arrived at the apartment that night, the sight of Lucas and Sophie fighting over a tablet in the living room greeted him. The part-time governess had already left, and tiredness was on the children's faces. He tried to intervene, but his stern tone only brought tears to Sophie's eyes. It was clear he needed help. Someone who could bring order without breaking the small moments of magic that seemed so common in others' childhoods, but absent from his children's lives. Meanwhile, Nina, now at home, was sewing one of the many torn teddy bears in her small rented room. Her mother, sitting next to her, stroked her hair, as she had done since she was a child. "You work too much, honey. When are you going to stop and enjoy a little?" Nina laughed softly, replying that one day, perhaps when problems would stop knocking on the door. The next morning, their lives collided by chance. Nina was at the coffee shop, serving a difficult customer who insisted on complaining about the whipped cream in her cappuccino. On the other side of the counter, Ethan was waiting for a black coffee without sugar. But the delay in service made him come closer. That's when he saw her, bending down to comfort a child who had spilled a hot chocolate, telling her everything would be okay, as she cleaned up the mess with patience and a smile. When he was served, he was surprised to see the badge. "Nina, right?" He pointed to the badge, his voice calm but incisive. She nodded, curious at his direct tone. "I know we don't know each other, but I think you can help my family." And so, with a mixture of hesitation and curiosity, Nina Carter took the first step into a world where the brightness of Christmas and the shadows of Ethan's past would begin to meet. The door of the luxurious apartment on 5th Avenue opened with a slight creak, revealing the vastness of a modern and imposing space. Nina Carter stood in the hallway, holding her backpack in both hands, feeling tiny against the glass walls that displayed Central Park in all its winter glory. It was like entering another world, where everything seemed perfect, but inexplicably cold. The housekeeper received her without smiling, indicating with a gesture that she should wait while she called Mr. Grayson. Nina tried to hide her discomfort, but her mind was in a whirlwind. What were you doing there? The job offer had come so unexpectedly that she barely had time to process it. Ethan Grayson had explained the basics at the coffee shop meeting. He needed someone reliable to watch his children during the day and, eventually, at night, while he faced the demands of a major corporate merger. His tone was matter-of-fact, almost mechanical, but something in his eyes had captured Nina's attention. There was a heaviness there, something he couldn't hide even beneath the facade of control. And then Ethan appeared, dressed in an impeccable suit and wearing an expression as unwavering as the one behind him. "Thank you for coming, Miss Carter," he said formally as he walked into the living room. Nina tried not to feel intimidated. but his presence seemed to fill the space almost tangibly. He led her to the couch where Lucas and Sophie were sitting, watching her with the reserved curiosity of children who had seen many people come and go from their lives. The silence was almost palpable as Nina knelt down to the children's level. "Hi, Lucas and Sophie. I'm Nina." His voice was sweet but firm, as if he wanted to assure them that he was there to stay, at least for a while. Sophie looked at her suspiciously, while Lucas muttered something inaudible and turned his attention back to his tablet. Ethan watched the scene from a distance, his arms crossed, his mind divided between the relief of finding someone with the maternal instinct he clearly didn't possess, and the fear that, like everyone else, she wouldn't last. He would never admit it, but the emotional chaos in his home was something he didn't know how to deal with. The next few hours were a test for Nina. Lucas, apparently curious about his new nanny, began following her around the apartment, asking questions ranging from "Why do you talk so funny?" until "Why don't you live in a place like this?" Sophie, on the other hand, remained distant, watching her with big, sad eyes, as if afraid to trust again. When Ethan returned at the end of the day, Nina was in the kitchen, improvising a gingerbread cookie recipe with the children. The sight took him by surprise. For the first time in weeks, he heard laughter coming from the room. Sophie, who always seemed so reserved, was smiling as she helped Nina cut the cookies into the shapes of stars and reindeer. "You have a talent for this," he said, his voice carrying a note of weariness, but also of something Nina couldn't identify. She looked at him, realizing that beneath all that rigidity was a man who cared deeply but didn't know how to show it. "I just try to treat them like children, not like mini adults," Nina replied, not afraid to be honest. Ethan didn't respond, but the expression on his face softened for a moment before he turned toward the office. That night, as Nina tidied up the guest room where she would stay, her thoughts were racing. Despite the luxury around her, there was a feeling of emptiness in that house, something that no amount of Christmas decorations or expensive gifts seemed capable of filling. And for the first time, she felt a twinge of wanting to change that, not just for work, but for the children who were beginning to capture her heart. Meanwhile, upstairs, Ethan looked out his office window, the illuminated city stretching out before him. He thought about Nina, the way she seemed to bring light to the apartment in such a short time. A part of him wanted to believe she could be different, but another was filled with doubt. People always left, and he feared that it would be no different with her. The clock said 6:30 am when Nina was awakened by a soft knock on the guest room door. When he opened it, he found Lucas with a blanket around his shoulders, holding a children's book. "Can I stay here until you get up?" The tone was hesitant, but the sincerity in his eyes made Nina smile and nod. "Of course, Lucas, but only until the alarm clock rings." He walked in, snuggling into the plush carpet like it was his safe zone. As Nina watched the boy, she thought about how he seemed to carry more weight on his shoulders than he should for his age. There was something about his withdrawn posture that reminded her of herself as a child, caring for her mother while the world around her seemed to fall apart. When he went down to the kitchen, he found Sophie sitting at the table, still in her pajamas, stirring the cereal flakes with her spoon without actually eating. She cast a quick glance at Nina before turning her attention back to her plate. Lucas followed his sister, excited to notice that Nina was preparing waffles with strawberry sauce. Ethan arrived moments later, wearing an expression that looked like a mix of tiredness and haste. He wore an impeccable suit and was checking something on his cell phone while talking to the housekeeper. As he smelled the fresh coffee, he looked at Nina with a raised eyebrow. "Do you always cook for the kids?" His voice was casual, but there was a hint of curiosity there. She responded without missing a beat as she served the dishes. "It's important to start the day with something that warms the heart. Plus, they deserve a decent breakfast." Her response was met with a curt nod, but she noticed the way Ethan looked away, as if the phrase had hit a part of him that he preferred to keep hidden. However, the day was just beginning, and the interaction between the two was far from smooth. When Nina suggested taking the kids ice skating in Central Park, Ethan, still stuck in his rigid routine, reacted with skepticism. "They don't like crowds," he said, as if to end the discussion. Nina, on the other hand, didn't back down. Maybe they like it more than you think. Sometimes they just need a chance to find out. She knew she had crossed a line, but the look in Sophie's eyes, filled with shy hope, made it worth it. Reluctantly, Ethan relented. However, he insisted on going along, under the pretense of supervising, but in truth unable to relax and trust. Central Park was vibrant, with children running, skaters laughing, and Christmas lights decorating every corner. Sophie was hesitant to put on her skates, while Lucas seemed more interested in observing the nearby squirrels. Ethan remained to the side, looking lost between his cell phone and his children. It was Nina who made the difference. She sat next to Sophie, holding her hand firmly as she showed her how to tie her skate laces. "Did you know that I was also afraid of skating?" she confessed, smiling. "But I've found that if you have the courage to take the first step, the rest comes naturally." Sophie, touched by Nina's softness, gave a small smile and stood up, staggering on her skates but steady enough to try. Lucas, upon seeing his sister's courage, soon followed suit. Ethan, outside the track, watched carefully. It was as if he was seeing a side of his children that he didn't recognize, a side that laughed, stumbled, and got up again without fear. And there was Nina at the center of it all, offering support without invading. For a moment, he felt a pang of something he couldn't name. Admiration? Gratitude? Maybe it was just the discomfort of realizing that she was achieving something that he, as a father, had never achieved. Later, when they returned home, the children were exhausted but happy, and Nina, even though tired, seemed to radiate an energy that lit up the room. Ethan called her into his office for a chat. "You were bold today," he said, leaning back in the leather chair. "I don't usually let kids go out like that." He tried to keep his tone professional, but Nina could feel the tension in his words. She responded calmly, but with conviction. "They need it, Mr. Grayson. Not just discipline and safety, but moments that make them feel like they're just children." Ethan was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the window, before finally muttering something barely audible. "Maybe you're right." Nina left the office with a heavy but determined heart. She knew there was still a long way to go, both with the kids and with Ethan, but at that moment, there was a small spark of hope, enough to continue. The first light of morning filtered through the living room's huge windows, illuminating a space that was beginning to transform. A decorative garland hung over the fireplace, and a makeshift Christmas tree, adorned with paper decorations made by the children, made the atmosphere less impersonal. Nina finished adjusting the twinkling lights while Lucas and Sophie ran around with laughter that filled the apartment like a long-forgotten melody. Ethan Grayson came downstairs, interrupting his morning reading of company reports when he heard the noise. He stopped when he saw the scene. Sophie was extending a shining star to Nina, who was kneeling to help her reach the top of the tree. Ethan stood still, overcome by a conflicting feeling. On the one hand, the sight was comforting, almost surreal. On the other, it was a reminder of how disconnected he felt from that joy. Lucas noticed his father's presence first. "Daddy, did you know that Nina can sing Christmas songs?" He pulled Ethan by the hand, trying to get him closer to the tree. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but his son's excited look made him hesitate. Nina, noticing the interaction, stood up, wiping her hands on her pants. "I was just trying to give the apartment a little more Christmas spirit," she explained, unapologetically, but with a tone that conveyed respect. The children helped a lot. Ethan, still a little uncomfortable, nodded. "It's nice." He found no better words, but Nina caught something in his hesitation. During the following days, Nina's presence began to leave deeper marks, both on the environment and on people. She insisted on including the children in activities that went beyond the classes and strict schedules Ethan had imposed. Sophie learned how to make gingerbread cookies, while Lucas helped decorate Christmas cards. Each small gesture seemed to bring them closer to her, and in brief, furtive moments, even to Ethan. One night, while the children were busy with a puzzle on the living room floor, Nina noticed Ethan sitting alone in the office. The door was ajar, and she hesitated before knocking lightly. "Are you well?" His voice was gentle but direct. Ethan looked up from his laptop, clearly surprised by the interruption. "I'm just trying to finalize the preparations for the merger." His response was brief, almost defensive. Nina crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "I could be wrong, but it seems like you have more on your mind than just work." Ethan let out a light sigh, running a hand over his face. "It's just..." He stopped, as if the words were hard to find. "It's been a long time since I saw Lucas and Sophie like this. So alive." He looked down at his hands, unable to look at her. "And I don't even know if I have any merit in that." Nina stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "They are still your children. All you need is to allow yourself to be there for them. It doesn't have to be perfect. They only want you." He remained silent for a moment, but something in his expression softened. "Thank you," he said finally. And Nina knew that simple thanks carried a weight he probably wouldn't admit out loud. However, not everything was easy. Sophie, although more open, still showed hesitation at unexpected moments. One afternoon, when Nina suggested that the children write letters to Santa Claus, Sophie refused, crossing her arms and saying, "He won't answer." Nina felt a pang in her heart, realizing that this resistance was not just childish, but deeply emotional. Kneeling down to Sophie's level, she responded gently, "Maybe it's not about the answer. Sometimes writing down our desires helps us remember what really matters." Sophie looked at her for a long moment, before finally picking up the paper and starting to write. Meanwhile, Ethan faced his own demons. He began watching Nina from afar, intrigued by her ability to connect with children in a way he never could. One night, while working late, he found a small Christmas ornament on his office desk, a paper star Sophie had made, with the words "for Daddy" written in crooked letters. The simple gift shook him more than he wanted to admit. That same night, he found Nina in the kitchen, organizing the gifts the children had made for their friends at school. "I haven't thanked you enough for what you're doing for them," he began, his voice low but sincere. She looked at him, surprised by the opening. "I'm not doing anything a parent wouldn't do. They have great potential for love. They just need someone to see them." The words hung in the air, and Ethan felt a lump in his throat. Maybe she was saying more than she knew. Night fell over New York with a fine snow covering the roofs and sidewalks, like a soft blanket that hid the harshness of the city. In the Graysons' apartment, Christmas lights shone brightly, reflecting off the glass windows overlooking Central Park. The atmosphere seemed calm, but inside that house, there was a current of invisible tensions. Nini was in the kitchen, finishing preparing hot chocolate for the children, who were playing in the living room. She heard laughter echoing a sound that had become common in the last few weeks, but still seemed like a miracle considering how it all started. Sophie had insisted that she use extra marshmallows in the mugs. "It's Christmas, Nina. Christmas needs cute things." She laughed, wondering how a 6-year-old could be so assertive. Ethan, on the other hand, wasn't home. He had sent a short message late in the afternoon, saying he would have an emergency meeting with investors. Nina felt a pang of disappointment when she read the text, but tried to ignore it. He had his reasons, of course, always had. Later, when the children finally fell asleep, Nina sat on the sofa with a cup of tea and allowed her thoughts to wander. The relationship between her and Ethan was changing. It wasn't just practical interactions, like discussing schedules or organizing children's activities. There were moments, fleeting glances and quick conversations that left marks in his mind. The vulnerability he had shown recently, it wasn't something she expected from a man like him. Just before midnight, the front door opened, and Ethan walked in, looking exhausted. His coat was covered in snowflakes that were quickly melting, leaving dark stains on the fabric. He saw Nina still awake and hesitated for a moment before walking into the living room. He didn't know if this was the right time for what he was about to say, but he couldn't stop himself. "Why do you do this?" he asked suddenly, throwing his coat onto a chair. Nina frowned, confused. "Do what?" "All this." He gestured vaguely to the room, to the environment that now brimmed with warmth and life. "You already have your own life, your problems, but still, here you are, dealing with mine." There was an intensity in his voice that took Nina by surprise. She thought for a moment before responding, choosing her words carefully. "I do this because I think everyone deserves a little love and attention, especially kids like Lucas and Sophie." Ethan looked away, crossing his arms as he took a deep breath. "And you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who does this for you?" The question hit her like thunder. She never expected to hear something like that from him, and for a moment, The words caught in her throat. "No one needs to do this for me," he finally replied with a sad smile. "I'm fine like this." Ethan was about to say something else, but was interrupted by the ringing of his cell phone. He checked the screen and his expression instantly changed, hardening. "I need to answer. We'll talk again later." He left the room quickly, but the moment between them hung in the air like an echo that wouldn't disappear. In the following days, harmony in the house began to fluctuate. Ethan seemed increasingly distracted, caught between meetings and incessant phone calls. Nina felt that something was different, but she didn't know what it was. The change also affected children. Sophie, who had started to open up, became isolated again, while Lucas, previously full of energy, became more reserved. One afternoon, while organizing the toys in the children's room, Nina found a notebook hidden under Sophie's bed. Hesitantly, she opened it and saw simple but emotionally charged drawings. A small girl, alone in a large apartment, with tears falling from her eyes. On another page, there was a figure holding hands with a brown-haired woman, surrounded by hearts. Nina realized it was her. Upon seeing that, Nina's heart sank. She felt deeply connected to Sophie, but also aware of how much that child needed something that she alone might not be able to offer. That night, Nina confronted Ethan. He was sitting in his office, surrounded by papers and staring at his laptop. "Ethan, we need to talk," she said, walking in without waiting for an invitation. He looked up, surprised, but said nothing. He just closed the laptop and waited. "The children are feeling your absence," she began, trying to keep her tone calm. "You're more distant than ever, and it's affecting them." Ethan frowned, visibly uncomfortable. "I'm doing this for them, Nina. Every meeting, every extra hour is to ensure they have a stable future." "And the present?" Nina countered, her voice gaining strength. "Stability in the future is no substitute for what they need now. You." The silence that followed was heavy. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I don't know how to be the father they need. Every time I try, I seem to only make things worse." Nina took a step forward, her expression softening. "You don't have to be perfect, Ethan. It just needs to be there. You just have to try." But before he could respond, a phone rang again, cutting off the conversation. This time, Nina didn't wait. She left the office, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. That night, while looking at the starry sky from the balcony, Nina realized something she avoided admitting to herself. She was getting too involved. It wasn't just about the kids. She cared about Ethan in a way that went beyond her role, and that terrified her. The cold night wind blew hard against the apartment's windows, making the Christmas lights flicker slightly, as if accompanying the growing tension inside the house. Nina was in the living room, carefully folding the children's clothes. His mind was in a whirlwind. The conversation with Ethan still echoed in her head, and the weight of her own emotions felt more intense than ever. Why was this happening? She thought, folding Lucas's small shirt. She had taken this job to help the children, to earn extra money and take care of her mother. None of this should be about Ethan. But every interaction with him pulled her to a place she wasn't prepared to face. Suddenly, the apartment door opened. Ethan walked in, his face drawn with exhaustion. But there was something else, an expression of concern that Nina couldn't ignore. He didn't take off his coat, walking straight to the office without a word. Nina hesitated for a few moments before going after him. When he opened the door, he found Ethan sitting in his chair, his head down and his hands covering his face. He looked broken, a man who carried the weight of an entire world on his shoulders. "Are you well?" Nina asked, her voice softer than she expected. Ethan looked up slowly, and the pain in his gaze hit her like a blow. "I had a conversation with the council today," he said, his voice hoarse. "They want me to spend more time in Boston to finalize the merger. That means staying away for at least 2 months. Nina felt her heart tighten. She knew what this meant for Lucas and Sophie. But there was something else about that statement that bothered her. 2 months away from home, away from her. "And what are you going to do?" He shook his head helplessly. "I have no choice, Nina. It's either that or risk losing everything I've built." Nina approached, crossing her arms. "Lose what, Ethan? You're already losing the kids. And if you continue like this, you will lose yourself too." There was a heavy silence between them. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a loud sound coming from the room. They both quickly turned around and ran over there. In the living room, Sophie was on the floor, with tears streaming down her face, while Lucas tried to calm her down. A broken glass cup was scattered across the carpet. Nina quickly knelt down, holding Sophie's shoulders. "What happened, dear?" I just wanted to get the juice," sobbed Sophie, pointing to the kitchen. "I didn't know it was going to fall." Nina hugged her, whispering that everything was okay, while Ethan stood there, watching. There was a look of guilt on his face that Nina couldn't ignore. It was as if he finally understood something that had always been there, but that he refused to see. After cleaning up the mess and putting the kids to bed, Ethan went out onto the porch. He needed air, needed to organize his thoughts that seemed increasingly chaotic. Minutes later, Nina appeared at his side, wrapping herself in a blanket to protect herself from the cold. "This can't go on, Ethan," she said, her voice firm but not harsh. "Sophie and Lucas need you, not only as a provider, but as a father." He fell silent, looking at the city lights below. "I don't know how, Nina. It's like I'm stuck in a cycle. Work, responsibilities, expectations. I don't know how to be more than that." Nina took a step closer, lightly touching his arm. "So let someone help you." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with emotion, and for a moment, it looked like he was going to say something important. But then he looked away, shaking his head. "I need time." Nina nodded, although she felt her heart sink. She knew she couldn't force him to face his fears, but that didn't make the wait any less painful. Later that night, while Nina slept, Ethan sat in the living room, looking at the Christmas tree they had decorated together. He remembered moments with his late wife, the promises they made to each other, promises he had broken without realizing it. He thought about Nina, her strength, her patience, and how she seemed able to bring life to a space that had previously seemed empty. But along with that came fear. Fear of depending on her, afraid that, like everyone else in her life, she too would leave. In the silence of the night, Ethan made a decision that he knew would change everything. The early morning silence was interrupted by the sound of falling snow, muffled by the glass walls of the apartment. Ethan Grayson was standing in the kitchen, holding a cup of cold coffee that he had forgotten to drink. His gaze was fixed on a distant point, but his mind was full of thoughts that kept spinning. Upstairs, Nina woke up with a strange feeling. The night felt heavier than usual, as if something was about to happen. Unable to sleep again, she went down to the living room. There, he found Ethan, still silent, his dark eyes reflecting the twinkling lights of the Christmas tree. "Ethan?" His voice was soft, but filled with concern. "Are you well?" He didn't respond immediately, just set the cup down on the counter and rubbed his temples, as if trying to get rid of a nagging headache. "Nina, there's something you need to know," he said finally, his voice low, almost a whisper. Nina felt a chill run up her spine. She crossed her arms, as if she could protect herself from what was coming. What it was. Ethan took a deep breath, hesitating before starting. "My ex-wife Elizabeth, she died 3 years ago, didn't she?" asked Nina, trying to fill the silence. "Yes," he replied, "but there is more. His death was not an accident, as everyone thinks." The words hung in the air, heavy and full of implications. Nina felt the ground feel more unstable beneath her feet. "She died because of me," Ethan continued, his voice shaking for the first time. "We argued that night, about work, the long hours, the decisions I made without consulting her. She left the house furious, and..." He stopped, closing his eyes tightly, as if he could shake the memory away. "And he never came back." Nina was silent, absorbing the raw pain he was sharing. For the first time, she saw the man behind the impenetrable CEO, a man filled with regret, a man who had spent years trying to carry guilt that was impossible to bear. Ethan looked at her, his eyes shining with a vulnerability he had never shown before. "I threw myself into work after that, trying to forget, trying to compensate, but it was never enough. And then the kids. I didn't know how to be there for them. Every time I saw them, I was reminded of Elizabeth and the way I failed her." Nina felt tears pool in her own eyes. "Ethan," she began, but her voice trailed off. "No, please let me finish," he said quickly. "You came into my life like a force I didn't expect. You brought joy to Lucas and Sophie, something I never could. But more than that, You brought something to me too. Nina's heart accelerated, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue. I'm afraid, Nina. Fear of letting you approach, because if I fail with you too. He couldn't finish the sentence, but Nina understood. She approached slowly, holding his hands firmly. Ethan, no one expects you to be perfect. Neither I nor the children, but you need to stop punishing yourself for what happened. Elizabeth is gone, but you are still here. And Lucas and Sophie need you, really. Ethan swallowed, feeling the weight of his words. For the first time, he realized that perhaps there was a way out of the cycle in which he was in jail, but only if he had the courage to change. Meanwhile, upstairs, Lucas and Sophie slept peacefully, oblivious to the emotional storm that happened among the adults. But in Ethan's heart, something began to transform. The day began silent, with the shy sun shining through the snow accumulated in the windows. Ethan was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. It was an almost surreal scene for him, the skillet squeaking with eggs as he tried to organize his thoughts. He had never done anything like that since Lucas and Sophie were born. There was always a housekeeper, a chef, someone who assumed the housework as he dived at work. Nina appeared at the door, her eyes slightly swollen by the tiredness of the night before. She stopped seeing him cooking, surprised and at the same time skeptical. Ethan, what are you doing? He turned, holding a spatula with an expression that mixed pride and discomfort. Trying to make eggs. It doesn't seem so difficult in the videos. Nina smiled softly, crossing her arms as she watched him. It was such a small moment, but meaningful. He was trying, and that was more than she could have expected. Lucas and Sophie came down soon after, and their reaction was equally unexpected. Dad, did you do that? Asked Lucas, looking at the plate with an expression of astonishment. Ethan nodded, feeling more vulnerable than he expected. Yes, and I promise it is edible. Sophie laughed, something that warmed Ethan's heart in a way that he hadn't felt for years. She took the fork and tried it. Okay, Daddy, not perfect, but good. Children's honesty made her laugh, and even Ethan managed to smile. For the first time, he felt that he may be on the right track, even if it was just the beginning. The following weeks brought significant changes in the dynamics of the house. Ethan began to leave the office early, dedicating the nights to being with his children. He read stories for Sophie before bed and played video games with Lucas, even though it was terribly bad. But it was not easy. Old habits had deep roots, and the moments of frustration were inevitable. There was a night when Ethan, delayed after an unexpected calling call, lost the play of the Sophie school. When he arrived at the auditorium, the place was already empty except Nina, who waited patiently with Sophie beside him. The look of disappointment on Sophie's face was a blow to Ethan's chest. I'm sorry, honey, he said, kneeling before her. I tried. Sophie crossed her arms, tears dripping silently. You always try, but never can, she answered, with the brutal honesty of a hurt child. Ethan had no answer. He felt the weight of his failures once more, but this time, something prevented him from retreating to his comfort zone. That night he sat with Nina in the living room, silent for a long time before she finally said, How do I do it, Nina? How do I stop failing with them? She looked at him, her kind but firm eyes. You don't stop failing, Ethan. You just keep trying. They do not need you to be perfect. They just need to know that you care enough to never give up. Her words stayed with him in the following days, echoing in his mind whenever he was trying to give up. While Ethan dealt with this transformation, Nina began to face her own fears. The connection he felt with him was getting stronger every day, but along with that came doubts that she couldn't ignore. One night, as she tittied off her guest room, she found her mother's picture framed in the little headboard. Thinking about the mother always brought her back to reality. She had responsibilities, bills to pay, and a life out of that luxurious apartment. What were you doing by allowing yourself to feel something for Ethan? She sat on the bed, holding the photo tightly. You would tell me to leave, didn't you, Mom? He whispered to herself. You would tell me not to hurt me. But deep down she knew it wasn't that simple. She had attached to Lucas and Sophie in a way she never waited. And Ethan. Ethan made her feel something she hadn't felt for a long time. One night, after the children were sleeping, Nina and Ethan met on the porch. The cold air made their breath to form clouds in the air. Thank you for not giving up on me, Ethan suddenly said, breaking the silence. Nina looked at him, surprised by the statement. "I don't do it for you, Ethan. I do for the children." He nodded, but there was something in his eyes that he said he understood. "Even so, I'm grateful." They were silent again, but this time it was a comfortable silence. The snow fell heavy, covering the city in a white cloak as a storm was approaching. Inside Grayson's apartment, the tension seemed to reflect the mood outside. Ethan was on the phone, his voice tense as he discussed the details of a crucial meeting that had been postponed by the storm. Lucas and Sophie were restless in the living room, and Nina distracted them with a board game, but irritation in the children was palpable. Ethan hung up the phone with a heavy sigh and rubbed the temples. He felt the weight of all the things that were on a thread: the work, the children, his relationship with Nina, which looked like a tightrope between proximity and distance. When he returned to the living room, he found Lucas whining because Sophie had won in the game. Sophie, in turn, crossed her arms in frustration. "Dad, you said you were going to help us make the snowman," complained, looking at him with eyes full of expectations and hurt. Ethan hesitated, the feeling of guilt growing up like a snowball. "Sophie, the storm is getting worse. We can't go out now." "You always have an excuse," she shouted, getting up and running to her room, with tears dripping on her face. Nina watched the scene in silence, trying to keep the composure, but she felt her heart tighten. Ethan looked at her, seeking answers, but only found the reflection of her own inadequacy. Nina took a deep breath and followed Sophie. The girl was shrunk on the bed, hugging her teddy bear tightly. When Nina sat beside her, she didn't look up. "He never fulfills what he promises," muttered Sophie, his voice full of hurt. Nina put her hand on the girl's shoulder. "Your father is trying, Sophie. He is not perfect, but he cares." Sophie finally looked at her, her eyes shining with tears. "So why don't you seem to want to be with us?" This question was like a knife in Nina's heart. She knew Ethan was fighting her own demons, but she also knew that Sophie couldn't understand that. "He wants to stay, honey. He just needs a little time to learn how." Later that night, Ethan was sitting alone in the kitchen, looking at a cup of coffee he had cooled. He heard light steps and looked up to find Nina. "You're judging me, aren't you?" he asked with a tired but bitter smile. Nina crossed her arms, leaning against the doorway. "I'm not judging you, Ethan. I am worried. With Sophie, with Lucas, and with you." He sighed, running his hand through his hair. "I don't know how to fix it, Nina. The more I try, the more I am ruining everything." Nina approached, sitting at the table beside him. "Maybe it's because you are trying to be someone else. Sophie and Lucas don't need a perfect father. They need you, the way you are, with your mistakes and everything." Her words were in the air, like an anchor trying to pull him back to reality. He looked at her, and for the first time, he felt that maybe there was a chance to do the right things. The next morning, the storm had worsened, covering the streets with dense snow. While Nina prepared breakfast, an unexpected call changed the rhythm of the day. It was the school, informing that Lucas had been injured while trying to climb a pile of snow in the courtyard. Ethan ran out with Nina beside her while Sophie was with the housekeeper. The hospital was full, but when he met Lucas, with a plaster on his arm and tears full of tears, Ethan felt a wave of emotion he couldn't control. "Daddy, sorry, I just wanted to..." Lucas started, but Ethan interrupted him, holding his hand firmly. "No need to apologize, son. I just want you to be well." It was at that moment that Ethan realized something fundamental. He could not continue to postpone the present in the name of an ideal future. His priorities needed to change, and he needed to start now. Upon returning home, Ethan gathered the children and Nina in the living room. He took a deep breath before speaking, his voice firmer than ever. "I want to apologize to you," it started, looking at Lucas and Sophie. "I know I failed many times, but I promise I will change." The children seemed surprised, but something in their expression softened. Lucas smiled slightly as Sophie nodded slowly, and then he looked at Nina. "Thank you for never giving up on me. I don't know where I would be without you." The simple but sincere words made Nina's eyes shine. She knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult path, but she also knew Ethan was finally ready to face him. The snow had stopped, and the winter sun shone shyly over New York, reflecting on the streets still covered in white. Grayson's apartment was full of laughs and conversations. For the first time in a long time, The house looked like a home. Ethan was in the kitchen, wearing a simple sweater, something I have never seen before. He was helping Sophie decorating Christmas cookies, while Lucas, with his armless arm, supervised the bench of kitchen island. Nina, when she observed the door scene, felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was like watching the end of a puzzle, where all the pieces finally found their places. She smiled when he heard Sophie complain that Ethan was exaggerating the confectionery. "Dad, if you put another snowflake, it will be impossible to eat it." Ethan laughed, a rare but genuine sound. "I just want it to be perfect for our party tonight." He looked at Lucas, who rolled his eyes on a joke. The boy had begun to show signs of a mischievous mood, something Nina knew to be a reflection of the lightness recently in her life. Later, while Nina helped Sophie put her dress, the girl looked at her in the mirror. "Nina, will you be with us forever?" The question made Nina's heart stop for a moment. She knew that her position in these children's lives was temporary, but the idea of leaving now seemed unbearable. She smiled softly, trying to mask the emotion she threatened to overflow. "As long as you need me," you replied, hugging Sophie from behind and straightening the girl's hair. That night the living room was lit by flashing lights, and the Christmas tree was the center of a magical scenario. Ethan had insisted on inviting some close friends and neighbors to a small party. For him, it was a symbolic gesture, a way to open the doors of his life that were previously locked by fear and guilt. Nina was in the kitchen, adjusting the last details of the table when she felt a presence behind her. When he turned, he found Ethan holding 2 glasses of wine. He offered her one, her shy but warm smile. "You made it happen," he said, his soft voice. "Not just today, but everything. I don't even know how to thank." Nina held the cup, trying to ignore the heat that climbed over her face. "You don't have to thank you, Ethan. What you are doing now, being present, this is all that matters." Ethan hesitated for a moment, his fixed gaze on hers. "Nina, I want you to know that." Before he could finish, Sophie appeared running, holding a small package in her hands. "Dad, Nina, you need to come now. We are ready to open the gifts." Ethan sighed, laughing softly as Nina blinked relieved, although she felt a knot of curiosity and something more on her chest. They followed Sophie to the living room, where Lucas was already sitting near the tree, with an excited smile on his face. The children began to open the gifts, and the room filled with laughter and exclamations. Ethan handed Nina a small package, which she opened carefully. Inside was a delicate star-shaped pendant. "I thought it was appropriate," said Ethan, his voice loaded with meaning. "You are the star that brought light to this house." Nina was speechless, holding the pendant hard as she felt her tears threatening to fall. "Thank you, Ethan. It's beautiful." While the night advanced, the guests said goodbye, leaving the family together near the fireplace. The children were exhausted, but happy, with Sophie fell asleep on the couch and Lucas dozes along with her. Ethan looked at Nina, who was sitting next to the tree, holding one of the drawings Sophie had made. He approached, sitting beside her. "I was trying to say something before, but I think this is the right time," he began, his voice firmer than before. Nina looked at him, feeling his heart to shoot. "You have transformed our lives, Nina. Transformed mine. I spent so much time trying to be the perfect man, the perfect father, but you showed me that all I needed was to be present, and you were by my side in every step of this path." He paused, taking her hand. "I don't want it to end. I don't want you to leave." Nina felt her tears dripping silently as Ethan continued. "I know I have a lot to improve, but I want to try. I want to build something with you, something real." She looked at him, her heart full of emotions that she couldn't express in words. Finally, she just nodded, and Ethan pulled her into a hug. Across the room, Lucas, who was apparently more awake than it seemed, smiled slightly before nap. The next morning, the city seemed brighter, as if nature itself reflected the freshness of a new beginning. Ethan, Nina, Lucas, and Sophie went together to walk in the snow-covered park. They laughed, threw snowballs, and built a doll that, according to Sophie, was the most beautiful they had ever done. As they walked back home, Nina looked at Ethan, who held the children's hands. He looked lighter, more complete. She felt a sense of hope that she had not experienced for a long time, a feeling that, regardless of what the future brought, they would face together.